Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Olga Mistropova. I am an assistant professor of Russian in the Department of World Languages and Cultures, and I'm also the director of REES, Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies program. And it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to our REES annual Distinguished Speaker Series event. And this year we're absolutely honored and delighted to be hosting Peter Baker as our distinguished speaker. Peter is a journalist, as you probably all already know, from the Washington Post. He's been at the Post for 19 years and currently serves as a White House correspondent covering President Bush. During his tenure at the Post, Peter has had a number of absolutely fascinating foreign assignments, including coverage of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. In fact, Peter Baker was the first American newspaper journalist into Afghanistan, right? Where he lived with anti-Taliban rebels and spent 8 months covering the conflict and the new government. Peter's talk today will address another one of his overseas assignments. Until late 2004, he served as the Post's Moscow bureau chief, covering Russia and the 14 former Soviet republics. His nearly 4 years in Russia dovetailed with the rise of current Russian President Vladimir Putin and put Peter at the center of several political, economic, and terrorism events, including the revival of Russian economy, the rollback of Russian democracy, the Second Chechen War, and such terrorist acts as the Moscow Theater Act and School in Beslan. In the fall of 2005, Peter, in co-authorship with Susan Glasser, published a book entitled Kremlin Rising: Vladimir Putin and the End of Revolution. Now, the paperback edition of the book just came out about a month ago. Peter says that it sold out immediately, supposedly because Iowa State bought all of the copies, and the copies are right on the table over there. So they're ordering a whole other batch of them, but ISU did get a whole batch of them. So Peter will be signing books at the end of his talk. I would also like to acknowledge the sponsors of today's event. They are Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies Program, the Committee on Lecturers, the World Affairs Series, the Miller Lecturers Fund, the Department of World Languages and Cultures, and the Department of Political Science. Peter's talk is also part of the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication First Amendment Day celebration. This said, please welcome Peter Baker, whose talk today is entitled Kremlin Rising: Vladimir Putin and the Russian Counter-Revolution.
Boy, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is a great crowd. Rudy Giuliani didn't get this many people when I saw him Saturday, so that's pretty good. I won't let that go to my head. I'm not planning to announce for anything, but I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Olga. It's a great honor to be able to come talk to Iowa State University. Olga's been a fantastic host, and I want to thank her for everything. It's an exciting time, obviously, to be on campus. First Amendment Days, that's great. I understand there's an anniversary being celebrated this year for the university. Is that right? Yeah. Well, it means it's all the better for me to come and see the campus and get a chance to talk with you guys about something that means a lot to me, and I hope to some people here, which is Russia and what's been happening there in recent years. How many people here have been to Russia? That's great. That's great. And how many people are planning to go or have some interest in studying in Russia? Terrific. That's great. This is going to be a fun evening, I hope. Then my wife Susan Glasser, who was my co-bureau chief and co-author, isn't here. I'm sorry you're not going to get a chance to hear her talk, because that would be a great talk. Instead, you got me. But when President Bush talks to audiences, he tells them. Before he came, he asked his wife, he says, what should I talk about? She says, talk about 15 minutes. So we'll try to keep to 15, 20, maybe a little bit longer, and then we'll open up for questions and we can get a real dialogue going. I think that's always the best way to get a good conversation going. For those who haven't been to Russia but are planning to go or study it, I really encourage you to do it. It's going to be a fabulous experience. It's really one of the most extraordinary places you'll ever have a chance to see. Interesting in so many ways, complicated, rich, layered, deep. As Olga mentioned, my wife and I were there for 4 years, basically overlapping with Vladimir Putin's time. We went there for the first time for our first reporting experience, that is in March of 2000, which was the month that Putin was formally elected as president. We left and returned home in November of 2004, coincidentally on Election Day here in America, which happened to provide a sort of a fascinating counterpoint to the democracy we've been watching for the past 4 years in Moscow. And as Olga mentioned, when we got home, we finished our book, Kremlin Rising, which, as she mentioned, is over there available for purchase. The afterword is meant to bring you up to date all the way up till this year. So it's an updated version of the book of what we've seen. And what we've actually seen since we returned from Moscow has only accelerated. The same trends, the same storyline, same narrative arc has only continued even more so up to the present day. So it's a very current and timely, important trend that's happening in Russia that America needs to think about and focus on. 15 years ago, this past Christmas Day, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, and the hammer and sickle flag over the Kremlin was hauled down. In theory, the Soviet Union ceased to exist at that moment, replaced by 15 theoretically, ostensibly independent, democratic states, including Russia, the biggest. But there were no parades this last December in Moscow to celebrate this anniversary. There were no fireworks. There was no national commemoration of an event that in many ways is perhaps the most profound moment in the latter half of the 20th century. Instead, that same month, by contrast, the 100th anniversary of the birth of Leonid Brezhnev was celebrated. It touched off a wave of nostalgia. Wreaths and flowers were laid at his tomb in Red Square. Conferences were held on his legacy. A street and a park were renamed for him. One state television correspondent even rhapsodized on air about how Brezhnev was really quite a hit with the ladies, end quote. A poll showed that more than 60% of Russians saw the Brezhnev era in a positive light, compared with only 17% who did not. So what should we make of a Russia today that grows misty-eyed over a period of stagnation and tyranny while growling that the breakup of one of the world's most authoritarian regimes in 1991 was, as Vladimir Putin put it, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century? What do we make of a country with all the trappings of a Western-style capitalist democracy, but the KGB-style cynicism to seemingly reach out and kill a critic with radioactive polonium in another country? Russia today defies easy characterization. It's not your father's Soviet Union. We're not in the new Cold War, as some people like to say. It doesn't pose a genuine military threat to the United States. Communism as a viable ideology is dead. It's not coming back. And everyday Russians today enjoy enormous freedom to live as they choose, without worrying that their neighbors are going to rat them out for making a joke about authorities. They can walk down the street and use their cell phones, and they can travel abroad and start businesses and watch foreign movies and surf the internet. And if you were to visit Moscow and only sort of walk around, you would think of it as much like a lot of European cities today. And yet, behind that picture, behind that sort of surface normality that we might recognize, the Kremlin has completed a nearly 7-year project to reconsolidate power and eliminate any serious opposition. It started out by taking over television, and then parliament, then business. It manipulated elections, and then when that became inconvenient, it simply canceled them altogether for the 89 governors in Russia. And now it's considering doing the same thing for big city mayors. It's intimidated human rights groups, assumed controls of newspapers one by one, and as anybody who watched the news or saw it on the news over the weekend, anytime even just a few hundreds, maybe 1,000 or 2 protesters show up on the streets, it responds with 9,000 police armed with batons and using them quite freely. 350-some people were arrested over the weekend for trying to protest the Putin government, including Garry Kasparov, the world chess champion who's become a leading opposition figure. Meanwhile, 10,000 people were rallying in behalf of Putin in Moscow's Pushkin Square, and the police very happily left them alone. You know, when we first went to Russia in 2000, we thought we were going for what would be a quiet time, you know, the era of stability that Putin was promising. The Yeltsin era, the era of tumult and anarchy and tanks in the streets and mafia-style banditry and gangland slayings, that was supposed to be over. The Putin era was going to be a new era, modernization, consolidation. But in fact, what we found during our time there, and since then, I think, too, is that change in Russia is every bit as profound now as it was in the 1990s. It's not as dramatic. It doesn't get on television. There aren't tanks involved. But the direction of Russia has changed. That what Putin has built is a very different society from the emerging democracy that the United States had hoped would develop from the wreckage of the Soviet Union. It's more stable, yes. People now have jobs. They don't lose their life savings. They don't resolve their political differences through violence, mostly. But it's also a less open society as well. By the time we left, people who had happily talked to us, or happily returned our phone calls for stories, no longer would let us quote them. They wouldn't come to the phone, or if they did, they begged us not to use their names. By the end of our tour, a much more closed atmosphere has settled in among the people who were dealing in elite politics, in business, in certain segments of society. So let's not over-romanticize Yeltsin's Russia, by the way. This is not to say that that was somehow an idealized Jeffersonian democracy. It wasn't. It wasn't by any stretch. It was corrupt and manipulated by the few at the expense of the many. It was imperfect on many, many levels. It was not completely free in the way we would hope it would be. But it was to the extent that Yeltsin had launched a revolution that, however flawed and incomplete, was at least opening up society, his successor came to power intent on putting an end to that. He said as much, Putin said as much, and rather explicitly for anyone who wanted to listen, even from the beginning. Early in his presidency, we had an interview with his top consultant, Gleb Pavlovsky. Gleb Pavlovsky is basically the Karl Rove of Russia. He told us, Putin has said he wants to end the revolution, not to start a new one. And that's what he did. So who is Putin? That was the question a lot of people were asking when we arrived. But it actually wasn't that much of a mystery. He was, by his own description, a childhood street hooligan, somebody who grew up dodging rats in a dirty, cramped communalka in St. Petersburg. He got into fights with other boys who were usually bigger than he was, and looked for opportunities, in fact, to fight them to prove himself. Like many young Russians of the era, he admired an old spy serial, The Sword and the Shield, which recounted the exploits of Soviet agents. In it, the hero, Yogan Weiss, said, "My ambition is to have as few people as possible to order me around, and to have the right to command as many as possible." And that was an ambition that clearly stuck with Putin. He joined the KGB, but had a relatively mediocre career. He served in a backwater in East Germany, Dresden, not even East Berlin, never rose above colonel in a service that made a lot of people generals. But he found the right patrons, and over time he found that his loyalty got him elevated again and again. And strangely enough, by the end of the 1990s, he found himself in position to become president of Russia. And after he took office, a Russian journalist asked him, what did he like about being in the Kremlin? And he said something that sounded very familiar to anyone who would watch Yogan Weiss. He said, quote, "Nobody controls me here. I control everybody myself." Actually, he didn't, not at first, but that's what he quickly set out to do. It became a very methodical campaign. He did, as I said, he took over television. He drove out the so-called Democrats from Parliament. He jailed or forced select oligarchs who dared to challenge him. He manipulated courts, eventually citing the slaughter of school children in Beslan 2 years ago, almost 2.5 years ago. He eliminated the election of governors and eliminated the election of independent members of Parliament. He's waged a brutal war in Chechnya that's left hundreds of thousands dead, missing, or homeless. And lately, he's been trying to take over, or his Kremlin has been trying to take over non-governmental organizations such as human rights groups and even newspapers, which have been relatively free of state control when we were there. Now, President Bush has confronted Putin about this on several occasions, and Putin dutifully tells him that he actually is for democracy. But he's also made clear that he has a different definition. In September 2003, a group of us Western reporters, American journalists, were invited to meet with him at his dacha outside of Moscow before President Putin headed off to America to meet with President Bush at Camp David. And we asked him about some of the things that had been happening lately that seemed to roll back democracy. And here's what he had to tell us. He said, quote, "If by democracy one means the dissolution of the state, then we don't need any such democracy." Now, of course, we didn't mean it that way, and we didn't define it that way, but he did, and so do many Russians. what they, after the 1990s, the very word democracy became associated in many Russian minds with chaos and disorder and crony capitalism and insecurity and tanks in the streets and lost savings and no guarantees and mafia and corruption. And so Putin basically had tapped into this sense of discontent and defined democracy as something that meant the collapse of the state, something to be avoided. He said this again to Bush in February 2005, when President Bush again raised the subject. Putin said, democracy should not be accompanied by the collapse of the state and the impoverishment of the people. Now, I don't know anybody who thinks it should, but that was how he viewed it. In his eyes, democracy and collapse of the state go hand in hand. And that's what happened to him in 1991, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. So Russia is left with what Lilia Shevtsova of the Carnegie Moscow Center, a very smart observer of Russian politics, calls imitation democracy. A news media that looks like CNN or Fox, but actually answers to the Kremlin. A court system with trials and judges who still convict 99% of all defendants. A parliament that's formally elected, but actually has an opposition party literally invented by the Kremlin. Elections where rivals who might actually knock off the Kremlin's first choice are then knocked off the ballot before anybody can take a vote. Governors who are ordered to produce quotas of votes in elections and now depend on the Kremlin to keep their jobs. A business community that faces the prospect of prosecution if it gets involved in politics. Putin's people have been very clear about this. Alexander Voloshin was his first chief of staff. He would tell people around the Kremlin, Russian people are not ready for democracy. It may or may not be true, but that was the point of view that they brought to the table. Others weren't even keeping this quiet within the Kremlin. Valentina Matvinenko is a Putin advisor who became governor of St. Petersburg, and she told reporters once who asked her about the idea of making a more parliamentary democracy in Russia, she says, we're not ready for such an experiment. The Russian mentality needs a baron, a czar, a president, in a word, a boss. Now, Putin's tough-fisted rule, combined with soaring oil prices, have transformed Russia today. When I visited last year, a massive new shopping mall had opened just about a block or so from our apartment where we had lived. It hadn't even started construction when we left. They say it's the largest shopping mall in all of Europe. The day we arrived in Russia to report on Putin's election in March 2000, IKEA opened its first store in Russia. 40,000 people showed up that first day. There was such a craving for Western-style consumer goods and lifestyles that they flocked to the doors of this new entry into the market. By the time I went back last year to visit, IKEA had 5 furniture stores and 8 malls in Moscow and plans for 11 more. It's now the second largest landlord in all of Moscow. It's a dynamic city these days. Its traffic is horrendous, but it's because there are 3 times as many cars on the roads, because people cannot afford them. There is now the beginning of a middle class. You now see 400 restaurants opening every year, not all just the high-end stuff for the oligarchs and expats, but actually stuff for the middle class, for everyday Russians. Markets where most people bought their meat and their vegetables and so forth when we first got there have been closing down, and instead you now see Western-style shopping, grocery stores, supermarkets, with very good quality food. The economy overall, is swimming in money. It's grown 5-fold under Putin, from $200 billion to $920 billion. And a government that in the 1990s was basically an international beggar, today has paid off all its foreign debt in full and early. So this is a good thing, obviously, to some extent. This is obviously a changing Russia. So many Russians are seeing themselves living better than they ever have. At the same time, this wealth hasn't trickled down everywhere. It's still confined mainly to Moscow and to some extent St. Petersburg and the second-tier cities, Samara, Nizhny Novgorod, and so forth. In many places in Russia, many villages in Russia you can go to, and you'll see people who are living the same way they did, frankly, hundreds of years ago. So it's a country of multiple parts, multiple layers. And it's also a country that demographically is in crisis. Russia the government doesn't focus on it as much as perhaps it ought to, but in fact it's a country that in some ways is literally dying off. For every 10 babies born in Russia today, 17 people die. Think about that. Think about that. The average lifespan for a Russian man today is 58 years old. They don't have a social security problem because people don't live long enough to collect it. Russians drink more, smoke more, commit suicide more than practically any other people on Earth. They suffer from some of the world's worst rates of heart disease, accidental death, tuberculosis, hepatitis, syphilis. Some 41,000 Russians die each year from alcohol poisoning. What do you think the number is in the United States? 400. 17,000 Russians drown each year. Why? They get drunk and go swimming. In Moscow alone, 2,700 Russians fall out of windows every year. Why? They get drunk, or they fall, or they push, or their friends are pushing them, or what have you. I mean, this is a crisis. This is a crisis, and this crisis has actually gotten worse. Some people, dismiss it all and say, well, it's always been this way. It's not, in fact, always been this way. It's a crisis that continues to escalate in some ways. And it's gotten even worse in the last few years because of HIV/AIDS. During the Soviet times, they didn't have HIV/AIDS as a problem. It was a closed society, and only a handful of thousands of people had it, even as late as the mid to late 1990s. But the drug trade from Central Asia brought it up in a fury through the heart of Siberia into European Russia, and it has taken hold in a powerful way. Grew faster in the time that we were in Russia than any place on Earth as a matter of growth. Today, the number of Russians who were estimated to be infected with with HIV/AIDS is roughly comparable to the United States, which is a country now with twice as much population and more than 2 decades of experience with the disease. And yet, the Department of Health, when we were there, had only 4 people dealing with HIV/AIDS, and only a handful, basically, of people were getting the triple cocktail that's become much more prevalent here in America. By 2050, according to some estimates, Russia's population will fall from 144 million to 102 million. And that's just one of the most optimistic scenarios. The one that's the worst case scenario has it falling to 77 million, which would be literally half its current population. So for all sorts of reasons, then, there's this sense of unease still in Russia, a sense that they've lost something. And that's what Putin taps into when he calls the collapse of the Soviet Union a catastrophe. One recent poll found that 15 years later, 61% of Russians regret the fall of the Soviet Union. We saw that repeatedly in our years in Moscow. Once at our own dinner table, we had a party, a dinner for a variety of people, some Russians, Europeans. I think we were the only Americans. Maybe one other American was there. And a young woman, a friend of ours, I think she may be early to mid-30s, westernized, smart, educated, got very mad when we were talking about Stalin in a negative way. She says, you people don't understand. We didn't have it so bad in the Soviet Union. Things were not so bad, and Stalin was a good man. And her husband is an American, and by definition, then, their son at the time was an American citizen. And they clearly had this argument before, and he says to her, but honey, how can you say this? Stalin did this, he did that. And she says, yes, but, everybody has to kill people in order to make a country run. And he says, what do you think history is going to remember Stalin as a hero or as a villain? And she says, as a hero, of course. He built our country. One poll in Russia today finds that 25% of Russians say they would vote for Stalin for president today. Now, it's important to understand this, not because we're right and they're wrong, but because if we don't understand how Russia sees their own history and how Russia sees their own past and their own experiences, then we can't possibly understand what they're going to do today or tomorrow. To cover our eyes and pretend that they're a westernized country like us is to miss the very essential nature of Russian history and what they have been through and the experiences they've had and how they look at their life today and their place in the world. All this helps us explain that Brezhnev nostalgia we were talking about. One Russian journalist wrote on a website in December that Russians were aching for the illusion of stability that Brezhnev provided. He wrote, quote, "People remember that wonderful feeling of not having to worry about anything because it was all decided for you, and you had simply to live peacefully, go to work, and pick up your wages. Give the people peace and quiet, immerse them in nirvana, and they will celebrate your 100th birthday with pleasure, too." That's what the Russian journalist wrote. Now, as long as they remain peaceful and quiet, Russians today can live relatively unbothered by the state. It's those who try to influence their country in a significant way though, that are risking harassment and prison and violence. You all have heard, I'm sure, of Alexander Litvinenko, the former KGB officer who died from radioactive poisoning in London and captured such attention in the West. But he was actually only the latest who had fallen out of favor to find himself in harm's way. Last year alone, a woman named Marina Litvinovich, who had been a Kremlin advisor but joined the opposition, was attacked in the street in what most people regard as a politically motivated assault. She was hit on the back, head in the head from the back. She lost 2 of her teeth. Her leg and back were injured. Face was bloodied and bruised. Murat Gelman was another guy who had been an advisor to the Kremlin. Both these people, by the way, are in our book, and you can read more about them. He had helped the Kremlin create this sort of faux opposition party, a nationalist party called Rodina. He was an ally of the Kremlin, and yet he was beaten when his art gallery hosted a show by a Georgian artist, because at the time Russia and Georgia were so at odds. 10 men showed up in his gallery with masks on, beat him and tore apart his gallery. The list goes on and on. You may have heard of Anna Politkovskaya, who was the most prominent Russian journalist. She earned an international reputation for her crusading coverage of Chechnya. She went down there and tried to tell the stories that nobody else was allowed to tell or brave enough to talk about. She was gunned down last year in her apartment building on Putin's birthday. Some people actually believed it was a macabre birthday present to him. Opposition leaders such as Garry Kasparov, we talked about, former Prime Minister Mikhail Kasyanov, who was Putin's own prime minister, are targeted by raids and financial investigations. And what's at stake is not just political power, and I think that's one of the things you have to keep in mind, too, as you watch what's happening in Russia today. Putin's top lieutenants these days generally serve not only as cabinet ministers, but also as the chairman of various state-owned entities with billions and billions of dollars under their control. Lose the Kremlin, and you lose access to those accounts. So that's why Russian officials bristle when we talk to them about democracy. They feel like they're lectured. They feel like they're condescended to. And they also feel threatened because there are vast interests at stake. The 2008 question is one that people in Moscow talk about. What will happen in 2008? What will happen when Putin steps down? The Constitution says he has to step down after 2 terms. He has said he's going to respect that and not change the Constitution. I have my doubts, but let's just say he does do that. The question is, who does he pick as his successor? And that's the real question, not who will be elected, but who does he pick? Because the election will be a contest between chosen people. There will be the one that they want to win, and they'll put out some other people that they intend to be competition, but who are not genuinely competitive, and in fact actually swear loyalty to the Kremlin. So what we see now is what I believe Churchill once called watching Russian politics like watching a pair of bulldogs fighting under a carpet. You sort of see the movement, but you can't quite define what's happening under there. And that's what's happening now. Condi Rice recently told us, as she looked back at the 15 years since that promising moment when the Soviet Union collapsed, she says, look, it has not been a straight line since then. And that's true, it has not been. There are obviously a lot of things that have changed for the better in Russia. It's still not the Soviet Union, and we have to remember that. But it also has not been a straight line to the new future that everybody in the West had thought might happen. In Putin's view, all this talk from the West is just a way of keeping Russia down. He said this last year. He said, quote, there are devoted Sovietologists who do not understand what's happening in our country, who do not understand the changing world. There's no need to argue with them. They deserve a very brief response. To hell with you. And that's Putin's message right now to the West. So we'll open it up for questions and see if we can't get a good dialogue going here. I think we got a microphone here.